The porcelain bowl in Clarice Vane's hands didn't tremble, even though her femur felt like it was being scraped by a rusted serrated blade. Every step across the marble floor of the gilded cage was a calculated betrayal of her own body. She wasn't just walking, she was performing. The hitch in her right hip, the slight dragging of her heel. It was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens. Hello everyone. I am so incredibly grateful to have you here tonight. Before we dive into this web of secrets and shadows, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop your city or country in the comments. How are you all doing today? If you've been enjoying these stories and haven't yet joined our community, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It truly helps us keep these stories alive, and I'd love to have you with us for every twist and turn. The atmosphere in the restaurant was thick, not with the smell of the seared wagyu or the vintage Bordeaux, but with the suffocating weight of unspoken death threats. This was neutral ground, a sanctuary of white linens where men who controlled the city's pulse came to negotiate who got to live and who had to bleed. Clarice approached table 9. The air there was colder, sucked dry by the presence of the man sitting at the head. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an architect of empires. "Sorry I'm late," Clarice said, her voice a practiced velvet, betraying nothing of the adrenaline screaming in her ears. She set the appetizer down. The man didn't look at the food. He didn't look at her face, which was a mask of professional subservience. His eyes, sharp as a glass shard, dropped immediately to her right leg. He watched the way she shifted her weight, the way her muscles seized in a microspasm to compensate for the accident she'd had in the alleyway 10 minutes ago. He knew. He didn't see a clumsy waitress. He saw a woman who had intentionally broken her own rhythm. He leaned forward, the shadows of the candle flame dancing in his dark irises. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer a platitude. "Who did this?" he asked. The question wasn't out of concern. It was an interrogation of her soul. He recognized the Limp for what it was. A fortress. A person who cannot run is a person who has decided to stay and fight, and in a room full of predators, that made Clarice Vane the most dangerous person at the table. She felt the fuse ignite. If she answered wrong, the peace of the restaurant would shatter. If she answered right, she was inviting a devil into her life who would never leave. "I did," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a countdown. Why would a woman who saw a murder plot in motion choose to cripple herself rather than flee? And what happens when the most feared man in the underworld realizes he's found the only person in the city who thinks faster than he does? The tension at table 9 didn't just linger. It solidified into something jagged. Clarice felt the weight of every eye in the room, but only one pair mattered. The man sitting before her was Elias Thorne. He wasn't just a patron. He was the gravity that held this volatile solar system together. To the world, Clarice Vane was a ghost. She was a woman who moved through the high-end halls of the gilded cage with the invisibility of the working class. But beneath the starched apron lived a mind that processed the world in blueprints and probabilities. Clarice didn't come from money, she came from survival. She had spent her youth in the foster system of North Jersey, learning that the loudest person in the room was usually the most vulnerable, and the quietest was the one holding the keys. Her deepest desire wasn't wealth, it was agency. After a lifetime of being moved like a pawn by social workers and predatory landlords, she had vowed that no one would ever see her coming. Her fear, however, was the very thing she was currently courting: being noticed. Elias Thorne watched her with a terrifying patience. He was a man who had built a criminal dynasty not on brutality, but on observation. He noticed the way the wine steward's hand shook only when pouring for the rival Moretti family. He noticed the micro-expressions of betrayal before the blade was even drawn. "You did it," Elias repeated, his voice a low hum that vibrated in Clarice's chest. "Most people break things because they are weak. You broke yourself because you are precise." "Why?" Before she could answer, the restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open. Julian Hunt, the floor manager and the closest thing Clarice had to an ally, hurried over. Julian was a man of frayed nerves and expensive suits, a former gambler who owed his life to the neutrality of this building. He saw Clarice's limp and his face went pale. He knew the rules: perfection or termination. "Clarice, what's the delay?" Julian hissed, though his eyes darted nervously toward Elias. "If you're injured, go to the back. We can't have..." She stays, Elias interrupted, not looking away from Clarice. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Julian withered, backing away into the shadows of the velvet curtains. Clarice felt a flicker of empathy for Julian. He was a good man trapped in a bad world, but he was a runner. If Julian had seen what Clarice saw in the alley, the silver tracking device slipped into the coat of the volatile Moretti underboss, Julian would have been halfway to the state line by now. And he would have been hunted down within the hour. Clarice leaned in slightly, pretending to adjust the silver salt cellar. "A runner is a target, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing in the foyer. "A stationary object is just furniture. And nobody kills the furniture until they're finished using the room." Elias's lips didn't move into a smile, but his eyes lit up with a predatory respect. He realized then that Clarice wasn't just a witness to a crime, she was a witness to a shift in the world order. In this moment, the connection between them was forged in the coldest of fires. Elias was a man who lived in a vacuum of trust, surrounded by sycophants and soldiers. Clarice was a woman who had just sacrificed her physical safety to play a psychological hand. They were two of a kind, intellectual outliers in a world that preferred muscle over mind. But Clarice had a secret that went deeper than the Limp. She hadn't just seen the tracker. She had seen who placed it, and it wasn't a rival gang. It was someone inside Elias's own inner circle. The stakes weren't just about a gang war, they were about a coup. And Clarice, with her self-inflicted wound and her tray of appetizers, was the only person who knew that the man sitting to Elias's left, his most trusted lieutenant, was carrying a remote detonator. If you're sitting on the edge of your seat wondering how Clarice is going to navigate this minefield, let me know in the comments. Are you the kind of person who would stay and fight, or would you have run? Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to join us. We're just getting started. The silence at table 9 was broken by the sharp metallic clack of a lighter. To Elias's left sat Silas Vane, no relation to Clarice, but a man who shared her surname by a cruel cosmic joke. Silas was Elias's right hand, a man built like a fortress who had served the Thorne family for 15 years. He flicked the flame to life, lighting a cigar with a hand that was unervingly steady. "The girl is hurt, Elias," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Send her to the kitchen before she spills wine on the Moretti contract. We don't need distractions tonight." Clarice felt the air in her lungs turn to ice. She saw the bulge in Silas's inner jacket pocket, not the shape of a gun, but the distinct rectangular silhouette of a signal booster. The inciting incident wasn't just the tracker she'd seen earlier. It was the realization that the betrayal was sitting at the very table she was serving. "She isn't a distraction, Silas," Elias said softly, his eyes never leaving Clarice. "She's an omen." Suddenly, the heavy front doors of the restaurant burst open. Entering with a trail of cold winter air was Dominic Moretti, the hot-blooded heir to the rival faction. He was flanked by two men whose hands stayed buried deep in their overcoats. The neutrality of the gilded cage was the only thing keeping the room from turning into a slaughterhouse. Dominic slammed a hand onto the table, vibrating the crystal glassware. "Thorne, we have a problem. One of my boys found a tail on our perimeter. Someone is breaking the truce." The room went deathly still. Clarice stood frozen, her weight still painfully distributed on her injured leg. She knew that if Dominic checked his pocket, he'd find the tracker. If he found it now, he'd assume Elias put it there. If he assumed that, he'd open fire. And if he opened fire, Silas would trigger the detonator she suspected was hidden under the floorboards or in the centerpiece, wiping out both leaders and leaving Silas to inherit the ruins. The decision had to be made in a heartbeat. Clarice could stay quiet and hope the blast killed her instantly, or she could step into the line of fire. "Sir," Clarice interrupted, her voice cracking just enough to sound like a terrified girl, play-acting the role of the victim she had forced herself to become. She stumbled, a genuine slip this time as her sabotaged muscles gave out, and crashed into Dominic Moretti. "Watch it, girl," Dominic snarled, shoving her back. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, clutching his sleeve for balance. In that split second of physical contact, her fingers dipped into his pocket. She felt the cold, magnetic disc of the tracker. With the dexterity of a card shark, she pulled it out and palmed it. But as she pulled away, she felt a hand grip her wrist like a vice. It wasn't Dominic. It was Elias. He looked at her closed fist, then up at her face. The revelation was instantaneous. He knew she had just stolen something from a man who would kill her for touching him. "Dominic," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory frequency. "My waitress is clumsy tonight. Why don't you take your seat so we can discuss this tale of yours?" As Dominic turned to sit, Elias pulled Clarice closer, his mouth inches from her ear. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. "You have 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't let him kill you for pickpocketing him," Elias whispered. Clarice didn't flinch. She opened her hand just enough for Elias to see the blinking red light of the device. "Because I'm not the one who put it there," she breathed. "But I'm the only one who can stop the man who did." The twist hit Elias like a physical blow. He glanced at Silas, his brother in arms, and saw the subtle way Silas's thumb was hovering near his jacket pocket. The hunt hadn't started yet, but the trap was already sprung. Clarice was no longer just a waitress. She was the only shield Elias Thorne had left. The air in the dining room became a physical weight, a pressurized chamber where the slightest spark would cause a lethal decompression. Elias's grip on Clarice's wrist didn't loosen. Instead it shifted, his thumb grazing the pulse point in her skin. He could feel her heart racing, not with the erratic beat of a victim, but with the steady rhythmic thrum of a soldier in the trenches. "Table 9 needs more wine," Elias announced to the room, his voice a calm mask that betrayed nothing of the war brewing beneath the surface. "Clarice, since you're struggling to walk, I'll help you to the cellar to select a bottle. Silas, keep our guest comfortable." The request was a command. Silas's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering between Elias and the waitress. He was a predator sensing a shift in the wind, but he couldn't move, not yet. To act now would be to admit his treason in front of the Moretti clan. Elias stood, tucking Clarice's arm into his own. To the rest of the room, it looked like a powerful man showing a strange, condescending kindness to a crippled servant. In reality, he was using his body to shield her from the line of sight of every weapon in the room. As they moved toward the back hallway, every step Clarice took was a fresh agony. The limp was real now, the inflammation in her joint screaming, but she leaned into Elias, and for a moment the physical proximity sent a different kind of jolt through her. There was a raw, magnetic pull toward this man, a shared recognition of two souls who lived in the in-between. Once behind the heavy velvet curtains of the service corridor, Elias pinned her against the mahogany paneling. He didn't use his weight to intimidate, but to create a private world where only their whispers existed. "Talk," he commanded. "Fast." Clarice held up the tracker, the small red light pulsing like a heartbeat. This was in Dominic's pocket. "It's a short-range relay. It's not meant to track him across the city. It's meant to trigger something when he gets within 50 feet of a receiver." "And where is the receiver?" Elias asked, his face inches from hers. She could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the intensity of a man who had seen everything and was finally seeing something new. "Silas," she breathed. "He has the booster in his inner pocket. He isn't just watching the meeting, Elias. He's the one who invited the wolf into the house. If Dominic finds out he's being tagged, he'll blame you. Silas triggers the defense protocol, the room goes up, and he's the only one who walks out with a story to tell the board." Elias's jaw tightened. The betrayal of a 15-year friendship was a bitter pill, but his focus remained on the woman in front of him. "Why tell me? You could have slipped out the back. You could have let us all burn." Clarice looked at him, her vulnerability finally peeking through the cracks of her calculation. "Because you're the first person who actually looked at me and saw a person, not a prop. And because I don't like messy endings." A ghost of a smile touched Elias's lips. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The gesture was surprisingly tender, an intimate bridge built in the middle of a collapsing world. "We have 12 minutes before Dominic grows impatient," Elias said. "The wine cellar has a service lift that leads to the alley. If you leave now, I can give you enough of a head start to disappear." "I can't run, remember?" Clarice gestured to her leg. "And I won't. If I leave, Silas knows you know. I stay. We play the game." The tension between them wasn't just about the danger anymore. It was the growing, undeniable attraction of two people who had finally found their match. It was a romance born in the shadow of a guillotine. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," Elias whispered, or the most insane? In this city, Clarice replied, there isn't much of a difference. She handed him the tracker. The plan was forming, a dangerous gamble of misdirection and red herrings. They had to neutralize Silas without Dominic realizing he was a pawn, all while Clarice played the role of the invisible waitress one last time. Before they stepped back into the lion's den, Elias leaned down, his breath warm against her cheek. If we survive this, Clarice Vane, I'm going to want an explanation for every scar you've ever given yourself. Are you rooting for Clarice and Elias to take down the traitor together? I want to hear your theories in the comments. How do you think they'll neutralize Silas in a room full of armed men? And if you're enjoying the suspense, don't forget to subscribe to follow this journey to the end. The transition back into the dining room felt like walking into a vacuum. The jazz music seemed to have slowed, every note a funeral dirge. Clarice followed Elias, her limp more pronounced now, her body beginning to throb with the dull rhythmic ache of the bone she had battered against a brick wall in the alley. Elias resumed his seat with a terrifying grace. He placed a dusty bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild on the table. A vintage for a turning point, he said, his voice ringing with a double meaning that only Clarice could hear. But as Clarice reached for the wine opener, her eyes caught something that stopped her heart. The midpoint of the night wasn't just a betrayal of loyalty, it was a betrayal of reality. As she leaned over to pour for Silas, she saw a tattoo peeking out from beneath his starched white cuff. It wasn't the Thorne family crest, nor was it the mark of the Morettus. It was a series of geometric lines, a cipher she recognized from her childhood in the foster system, a mark belonging to a shadowy collective known as the Architects, a group that profited not from crime, but from the systemic collapse of entire cities. This wasn't a coup within a mafia family. This was an assassination of an entire ecosystem. The revelation hit her. Silas wasn't trying to take over Elias's empire. He was paid to burn it down so a third party could buy the ashes. And that third party had been watching her from the start. Your hand is shaking, Clarice, Silas whispered, his eyes boring into hers. He reached out and gripped the neck of the bottle, his thumb pressing firmly against the glass. Perhaps the injury is more severe than we thought. Maybe you need to be retired. The stakes didn't just rise, they hit the ceiling. Clarice realized that if she signaled Elias now, Silas would trigger the device. But if she didn't, Elias would walk right into the slaughter. The wine needs to breathe, Mr. Vane, Clarice said, her voice a sharp blade of ice. She looked Silas directly in the eye, dropping the clumsy waitress act for a fraction of a second. Just like a secret. If you keep it bottled up too long, it turns to vinegar. Elias caught the shift in her tone. He saw the way she looked at Silas's wrist. He was a man of immense intelligence and he connected the dots instantly. The tracker wasn't just for Dominic. The tracker was a beacon for a tactical team already positioning themselves on the roof. The shared vulnerability between Clarice and Elias reached its zenith. In a room full of people, they were the only two who were truly alone. Elias reached under the table, his hand finding Clarice's knee. It was a gesture of grounding, of mutual survival. He wasn't just protecting his asset. He was protecting the only person who truly understood the language he spoke. Dominic, Elias said, turning to the Moretti heir. I think it's time we showed Silas what happens to men who play with fire in a wooden house. Suddenly the lights flickered. A low, electronic hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The fuse was no longer a metaphor, it was literal. Who did this? Dominic roared, finally sensing the trap, his hand flying to his holster. The same person who gave her the limp, Elias said, his voice rising over the hum. The person who thinks we're too stupid to see the strings. Silas didn't flinch. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew he'd already won. The beauty of a collapse, Elias, is that it doesn't matter who sees it coming. It only matters who is standing when the dust settles. He reached for his pocket. Clarice knew she had a half second. She didn't use her hands. She used the very weakness she had created. She collapsed her weight onto her injured leg, intentionally falling toward the table, her body becoming a human wedge between Silas and the signal booster. What do you think is hidden in that signal booster? Is it a bomb or something even more calculated? Tell me your wildest guesses in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this high-stakes game of chess, make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss the climax. The crash of the table was deafening. Fine crystal shattered like ice, and the vintage wine bled across the white linen like a fresh wound. Clarice hit the floor, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, but she had achieved her goal. She was a physical barrier. However, the darkest hour began not with an explosion, but with a terrifyingly calm click. Silas didn't need to reach his pocket. He had a secondary trigger built into his watch. "You were right about one thing, Clarice," he sneered, looking down at her as she sprawled in the glass shards. "A stationary object is just furniture. And I'm done with the decor." The restaurant's reinforced shutters slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, sealing every exit. Then the gas began to hiss from the vents. A fast-acting paralytic, not a lethal poison. Silas wasn't looking to kill everyone. He was looking to kidnap the heads of the two most powerful families in the city while they were helpless. "Elias!" Clarice tried to scream, but her lungs felt like they were filling with wet cement. Through the haze she saw Elias lunging for Silas, but the gas was already taking hold. His movements slowed, his powerful frame stumbling. He looked at Clarice, his expression a haunting mixture of fury and heartbreak. For the first time, the man who controlled everything was powerless to protect the one woman who had risked her life to warn him. "Take them," Silas commanded. Shadowy figures in tactical gear dropped from the ceiling. The architects. They ignored Clarice. To them she was just a broken waitress, a casualty of the environment. They moved with surgical precision, zip-tying Elias and Dominic. "Wait," Elias rasped, his eyes locking onto Clarice's as he was dragged toward the kitchen's service elevator. "Leave her. She has nothing to do with this." Silas kicked Clarice's injured leg as he walked past, a cruel, unnecessary blow that sent a white-hot spike of agony through her nervous system. "She's a witness, Elias. And witnesses are the one thing I don't leave behind. Once we're clear, the cleaners will finish the job." The elevator doors hissed shut. Clarice was left alone in the darkened, gas-filled room. The silence was more terrifying than the chaos. Her body was heavy, her limb was thrumming with a rhythmic, sickening pain, and the man who had looked at her and seen a thinker was being hauled away to a black site grave. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the cold marble, watching the red light of the tracker she'd dropped. It was still blinking. A tiny, rhythmic heartbeat in the dark. The situation was insurmountable. She couldn't walk, she couldn't breathe properly, and an elite cleanup crew was likely minutes away from entering the building to erase all evidence, including her. She felt the cold seep of despair. She had played the most brilliant game of her life and she had lost. She had chosen to stay, and now she was going to die in a room full of broken glass and expensive wine. The romance that had sparked in the shadows felt like a cruel joke now. Elias Thorne was gone, and the only person who knew the truth was a girl who had purposefully crippled herself. The darkness of the restaurant was absolute, save for the rhythmic, taunting pulse of the red LED on the tracker. Clarice's lungs burned, each breath a struggle against the lingering paralytic gas. She could feel her consciousness slipping, the sweet pull of surrender whispering that it would be easier to just close her eyes. But then she remembered the look in Elias's eyes before the elevator doors closed. It wasn't just a look of defeat, it was a look of recognition. He hadn't seen a victim. He had seen a partner. The realization acted like a jolt of pure adrenaline to her heart. Clarice Vane didn't survive the foster system and the streets by waiting for a hero. She survived by being the variable no one accounted for. She rolled onto her stomach, the shards of glass cutting into her palms, and began to crawl. She didn't head for the front doors. Those were deadbolt from the outside. Instead, she dragged herself toward the bar. Her limp was no longer a strategic choice. It was a physical reality, but she used the pain as a tether to keep herself focused. "Think, Clarice," she hissed through gritted teeth. She reached the bar service station and pulled herself up using the brass rail. Her eyes fell on the high-end espresso machine. It was connected to a dedicated high-pressure water line and a separate electrical circuit. More importantly, she knew the building's schematics better than Silas ever would. The restaurant was an old bank vault. The kitchen's service elevator operated on a weighted pulley system that shared a junction box with the bar's heavy-duty cooling units. If she could short the circuit here, she wouldn't just kill the lights. She would freeze the elevator between floors. She grabbed a bottle of high-proof absinthe and a heavy silver cocktail shaker. With a cry of exertion, she smashed the shaker against the espresso machine's control panel, exposing the wires. Then she drenched the electronics in the alcohol. "Who did this?" she whispered, echoing Elias's question. "I did." She struck the lighter she'd swiped from the table earlier. A blue flame erupted, followed by a violent crack of blue electricity. The entire building groaned. Above her, she heard the screech of metal on metal, the sound of an elevator car grinding to a halt in the shaft. She had them trapped. At that moment, the back service door kicked open. It wasn't the cleanup crew. It was Julian, the manager. He looked terrified, but when he saw Clarice standing, trembling, bleeding but standing, he dropped his keys. "Clarice, what have you done?" "I've leveled the playing field, Julian," she said, her voice regaining its velvet iron. "The architects think they've won because they have the muscle. They forgot who runs the house." She reached into her apron and pulled out the one thing she'd kept hidden since the alleyway, the master override key for the restaurant's security shutters. She hadn't just sabotaged herself to stay, she had stayed to control the exit. "Get the Moretti guards from the perimeter," she commanded Julian. "Tell them their boss is a hostage but the traitor is trapped in the lift. If they want their heir back, they follow my lead." The hope that flooded through her was electric. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the architect of the counterstrike. She was going back for Elias, not as a damsel, but as the only person capable of navigating the labyrinth she had just created. The metal guts of the gilded cage screamed as Clarice led the charge toward the stalled elevator. Behind her, 3 of Dominic Moretti's elite enforcers moved like shadows, their suppressed weapons drawn. They were confused, taking orders from a limping waitress in a blood-stained apron, but the fire in Clarice's eyes was more commanding than any general's shout. "The lift is caught between the mezzanine and the cellar," Clarice directed, her voice sharp and surgical. "There's a maintenance hatch in the ceiling of the wine vault. If we don't get there in 90 seconds, Silas will realize the override came from the bar and he'll blow the emergency brakes to drop the car." She didn't wait for them to agree. She pushed through the pain, her right leg dragging but her pace relentless. They reached the cellar, the air smelling of damp stone and old grapes. Above them, muffled shouts and the heavy thud of a boot against metal echoed down the shaft. "Boost me," Clarice commanded the largest guard. "You're hurt, lady, let us." "I know the wiring. If you cut the wrong lead, the car drops and everyone inside is crushed." "Boost me." The guard hoisted her up. Clarice gritted her teeth, the agony in her hip blurring her vision, but she forced her fingers to be steady. She popped the hatch and slid into the dark, cramped space between the elevator car and the shaft wall. Inside the car, she could hear Silas's frantic voice. "I don't care about the circuit. Prime the charge. If we can't take them out, nobody leaves." Clarice looked through the narrow gap in the elevator's sliding doors. Elias was pinned against the back wall, his face bruised but his gaze fixed on the ceiling. He saw her. For a split second, the mask of the Mafia boss shattered, replaced by a raw, staggering look of pride. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. He began to struggle against his ties, drawing Silas's attention away from the hatch. "Sit down, Elias." Silas screamed, pulling a detonator from his pocket. "You're losing, Silas," Elias said, his voice a calm, deadly silk. "You didn't factor in the furniture." Clarice reached down, her fingers finding the manual release lever. At the same time she swung her heavy silver wine key, the tool of her trade, into the back of the architect soldier standing nearest the door. As he stumbled, she didn't go for a gun. She went for the signal booster in Silas's pocket. With a roar of defiance, she threw herself through the hatch and onto Silas's back. The momentum sent them both crashing to the floor of the elevator. Silas, stunned by the sheer audacity of the attack, lost his grip on the detonator. "Now!" Clarice screamed. The Moretti guards outside forced the doors open. A flurry of movement followed. The crack of a pistol whip, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, and the metallic snip of zip ties being cut. In the center of the chaos, Clarice was pinned under Silas. He snarled, his hand closing around her throat. "You ruined everything. You're just a waitress." "I'm the waitress," Clarice wheezed, her hand finding a discarded steak knife from the dinner service that had fallen during the struggle. "Who saw you coming?" She didn't kill him. She drove the blade into the meat of his shoulder, the pain forcing him to release her. Before he could recover, a heavy boot slammed into his chest, pinning him to the floor. Elias stood over him, his hands free, his presence radiating a cold, terrifying power. But Elias didn't look at Silas. He reached down and scooped Clarice up into his arms, lifting her away from the blood and the glass. "I've got you," he whispered. The twist wasn't the rescue. The twist was the silence that followed. Dominic Moretti stood up, dusting off his suit, looking at Elias and Clarice. The silent war that was supposed to start tonight was dead. Silas's betrayal had done the unthinkable. It had united the two families against a common, invisible enemy. "Thorn," Dominic said, nodding toward Clarice. "Your girl just saved the city. I'm calling off the perimeter. We're square." Elias didn't look at Dominic. He looked at Clarice, who was finally letting the exhaustion take her. "She isn't my girl, Dominic," Elias said softly. "She's the only reason you're still breathing. Treat her with the respect she's earned." The sun began to bleed over the Manhattan skyline, casting long amber shadows across the terrace of Elias's private estate. The violence of the night before felt like a fever dream, a ghost story told in the flickering light of a candle that had finally burned out. Clarice sat in a deep velvet chair, her right leg propped up and wrapped in a clean, professional bandage. The doctors Elias had summoned, men who moved with the same quiet efficiency as his soldiers, had confirmed that while the injury was painful, her calculated sabotage hadn't caused permanent damage. She had known exactly how much she could break without losing herself entirely. A shadow fell over her and the scent of sandalwood returned. Elias stepped onto the terrace, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He had traded his blood-stained dress shirt for a simple black sweater, making him look less like a king of the underworld and more like a man who had finally found something worth keeping. "The architects have been scrubbed from the city," Elias said, handing her a cup. "Julian is safe. He's been promoted to general manager of the Gilded Cage, under my personal protection. And Silas will never see the sun rise again." Clarice took a sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. "And the Morettis?" "Dominic sent a gift. A vintage 1945 Rothschild to replace the one you smashed." Elias chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "He told me that if I ever let you go back to waiting tables, he'd hire you as his head of security." Clarice looked out at the city. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost or a pawn. She felt seen. The girl who had spent a lifetime making herself invisible had finally found the one person whose eyes were sharp enough to find her in the dark. "I'm not going back," Clarice said firmly. "To the restaurant or to being invisible." Elias sat on the edge of the stone balustrade, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I wouldn't let you if you tried. I spent 40 years looking for a partner, someone who sees the world the way I do. I didn't expect to find her holding a soup tureen." He reached out, his hand covering hers. "You asked me once why I wanted an explanation for every scar you've given yourself. I don't need the stories anymore, Clarice. I want to be the reason you never have to give yourself another one." The romantic tension that had simmered in the blood and shadows of the restaurant finally boiled over into a quiet, profound peace. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a pact. 2 thinkers, 2 survivors, standing at the edge of a new empire they would build together. Clarice leaned back, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Her limp would fade, her bruises would heal, but the power she had claimed in that room full of predators was hers forever. "So," she said, her eyes sparking with a hint of the brilliance that had saved them both. "What's our next move?" Elias squeezed her hand, his gaze turning toward the horizon. "Whatever it is, we do it together. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you for watching to the end. Share your opinion about this story in the comments below. I like getting feedback from my audience. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories.